especially the following points of a misconception about the relation between old Aristotelian or classical logic and the new deviant imaginary or non-classical logic should be addressed. First, Vasiliev holds that the logical laws are determined by the features of the world. They can be sound in one world, but unsound in another world. Quote, while the Aristotelian logic is true in our world, the non-Aristotelian logic can be true only in some different world. This other world of the non-Aristotelian imaginary logic is a world differing from the real world, an imaginary world, a world poorly ideally constructed. Quote, the new logic lacks this connection with our reality. It is a poorly ideal construction. Only in another world than ours, in an imaginary world whose basic qualities we can exactly define. By the way, the imaginary logic can become a knowledge instrument, a tool for producing knowledge. Based on the different world reference of classical and imaginary logic, Vasiliev draws the conclusion that between the two logics exists a contradictory opposition, confusing contradictory with contrary, because he intends to assert only that the formula of classical imaginary logic are excluding each other. Quote, the formula of both logics will stand in a contradictory opposition. The truth of the formula of imaginary logic excludes the truth of the formula of our Aristotelian logic and vice versa. Because of this, not both can be true for one and the same world. Vasiliev presupposes only two different worlds, the real and the imaginary world. However, it is not excluded that one considers different imaginary worlds for which, according to Vasiliev, different logical laws would be true. Third, Vasiliev has in mind a special imaginary world, one in which the law of contradiction does not hold. In the imaginary world, one logical law is missing, which holds in the Aristotelian logic. Quote, the non-Aristotelian logic is a logic without the law of contradiction. Here it will not be redundant to add that just the non-Euclidean geometry served as a model for the construction of the non-Aristotelian logic. But in the imaginary logic we have no law opposite to the law of contradiction, which would stand in a contrary opposition to the law of contradiction, as Vasiliev suggests with his remark about the contradictory relation between the laws of the two logics. In the imaginary logic, this law is not substituted by a special new law, only valid in the imaginary world. Indeed, one could understand as such a law of the imaginary logic the following existence assertion. There are such situations in which the sentence P as well as the sentence non-P are true. Then this law would really stand in a contradiction to the classical law. In no situation the sentence P as well as the sentence non-P can be true. Now, however, the mentioned existence statement is no law, but merely states that the law of contradiction is not valid. However, the statements that this law is valid and that it is not valid stand in the contradictory relation. Fourth, Aristotelian and imaginary logic do not contain laws contradicting each other. However, different meta-assertions are valid for these logics, stating that a law is valid in one of them or is not valid there. In this sense, these different logics are confronted contrary but not contradictory, because if a law is not valid in the Aristotelian logic, this does not mean that it is valid in the imaginary logic and vice versa. Fifth, interestingly, Vasiliev indicates no logical law which holds in the imaginary logic but does not hold in the Aristotelian logic. In Vasiliev's new imaginary logic, we have no new laws in comparison with the old Aristotelian logic. In this sense, the imaginary logic turns out to be a subsistence of the old Aristotelian logic and therefore cannot contain any laws which would contradict the Aristotelian logic. This kind of relation between classical and imaginary logic is expressed directly by Vasiliev when he writes, "One receives the logic just from the synthesis of some more independent axioms." In a footnote he writes, "The mathematical logic can serve as an elegant proof of that, having several axioms and postulates as its basic. We must come to the conclusion that rejecting some axioms and the construction of a logic without them is completely conceivable." This is not in accordance, of course, with the starting assertion of Vasiliev that the new logic contains law which would contradict those of the old logic. As already emphasized on top, Vasiliev stresses the difference between Aristotelian and non-Aristotelian logic concerning the invalidity of the law of the contradiction in the non-Aristotelian logic. This way, Vasiliev places the imaginary logic in the era of the power-consistent logics. When Vasiliev widens the look for the possibility of non-classical logic, he does this nevertheless in a one-sided manner. But to him, it can be conceded that he responds at least to an important possible divergency between classical and non-classical logics. If he represented in this connection his source view that in the imaginary logic such laws would be included which contradict the laws of the classical logic, then this would result in accepting the negation of the law of the contradiction as a law in the imaginary logic. This would be fitting for the purpose of a strictly dialectic logic instead of P and non-P. The expression P and non-P would have to be accepted as a law. Then in this dialectic view, a sentence and his negation are equivalent to each other. The speech about negation or denials becomes generally superfluous in this dialectic logic. Indeed, Vasiliev is not a supporter of this strictly dialectic view, but he supports only the power-consistent view. Wherefore, he also does not accept the negation of the contradiction law as a new law in the concrete determination of his imaginary logic, but he merely abandons the acceptance of the contradiction law. Quote, "The imaginary logic is a logic which is free of the law of the contradiction." Now the law of the contradiction expresses is understood by what the law of contradiction expresses is understood by Vasiliev in an ontological sense. A cannot be non-A. No object includes a contradiction in itself. In this sense, there is no doubt that the validity of the contradiction law in our world. There are no ontological situations in our world in which assertive and negative judgments about the same object can be true, and in this sense no object includes a contradiction into itself. But there can be epistemic situations in which contradictory assertions can be formed about an object which does not include a contradiction in itself. And such epistemic situations are not excluded by the laws governing our world. So the existence of epistemic contradictions is entirely compatible with the soundness of the law of contradiction in our world. Without having to leave our world, space is made for Vasiliev's imaginary logic if we are referring to epistemic worlds of assent or imagination in which a sentence and its negation can be taken for true at the same time. These epistemic worlds differ from the ontological words, not only in the fact that a sentence and its negation can be true simultaneously, but also in the fact that neither the sentence nor its negation are asserted or taken as true in the imagination, thus neither the sentence nor its negation being epistemically true. The possibility of the imaginary logic is bound to the possibility of imaginary words, and these words are epistemic words, not ontologically realized or realizable words, which are presupposed in a dialectic conception of logic. With the determination of imaginary words as epistemic words, we absolutely agree with Vasiliev, who determines the imaginary words were merely just as imaginable words which can exist in our consciousness. The epistemic words are exactly such imagined words, but not real words, and they do not have to be ontologically possible words. Also, they are epistemically possible words. In these epistemic words, a different logic to the logic of the real world is actually valid. In epistemic words, all sentences are true which are explicitly assented to by the epistemic subject. However, what logically results from epistemic truth is also epistemically true. Therefore, all logical consequences from sentences which are explicitly assented to by the epistemic subjects are epistemically true. Epistemically truth in this sense is equivalent to what is nominally captured by the idea of implicit assent or implicit belief. The logic that determines whichever epistemic truth can be derived from given epistemic truth is the imaginary logic. And this imaginary logic cannot be the traditional classical logic, the logic of our world, which presupposes that a sentence or its negation has to be true, and not both of them can be true. The imaginary logic has to live with the logical possibility that both a sentence and its negation are epistemically true, and none of them is epistemically true. So the imaginary logic has to exclude not only the principle of contradiction and the excluded middle, but all those classical sound principles which presuppose that a sentence and its negation cannot be both true, and that one of them has to be true. This points in the direction of the system of tautological entailments of Anderson-Belknap as the right imaginary logic. The definition of the negation gets a semantic change in the epistemic words. We come to a negation distinguished from the classical negation. And this change is another negation of the in the imaginary logic, as is also demanded by Vasiliev. Quote, because the law of the contradiction is a result from the definition of the negation to build up a logic free of the law of contradiction indicates to build up just such a logic in which our negation, which is led back on the incompatibility, does not exist. Here the imaginary logic also begins. Her method consists in the construction of another negation than ours, in the generalization of the concept of the negated judgment. Vasiliev applies his considerations concerning the treatment of the negation in the imaginary logic to the traditional syllogistic and comes to the result that certain modes valid in the traditional syllogistics lose their validity in the imaginary logic. Also, the interpretation of the categorical judgments occurring in the syllogistic modes remain unchanged. Vasiliev applies his considerations about the imaginary logic, however, not to modern Freudian logical systems, which he calls mathematical ones. In particular, he does not examine which effects his new view about contradiction and negation would have for the propositional logic. He does not examine how an imaginary propositional logic could be determined. In the following, I want to deliver attempts for the development of imaginary propositional logic for epistemic contexts. These attempts are oriented on the question which logical systems would originate if one changes the semantic regulations of the classical propositional logic merely in its relation to the negation for the purposes of imaginary logic, but which leaves unchanged the interpretation rules which refer to other logical connections, as far as these rules are independent from the treatment of negation, as well as Vasiliev leaves unchanged the interpretation of the categorical judgment in the imaginary logic. The fundamental notion of the semantics for an epistemic propositional logic is not the classical notion of truth, but the notion of epistemic truth. A sentence is epistemically truth relative to an epistemic subject if this sentence logically follows from those sentences which are assented to by this epistemic subject. This way, the notion of epistemic truth, as I already said, corresponds to a notion which is usually conceived as implicit assent. Related to different epistemic subjects arise different sets of epistemic and imaginary truths. For every epistemic subject, every speaker exists a set of epistemic possible words or alternative imaginary words from which one is the actual epistemic word for the speaker. In different possible objective words concerning the same epistemic subjects exist possible different epistemic words and different epistemic truths. Following this, the development of a semantic foundation for an epistemic logic of assent, we distinguish two kinds of specific words in the set of possible words. W, real objective words, and imaginary epistemic words. The sentence G is true in a possible world W exactly when G is an element of this world. The semantics for the imaginary words and the corresponding implicit logic of assent is in that sense orientated on the classical semantics, but this semantics is transformed into semantics for classical logic if the following rich principles are added to the epistemic semantics. This means if is added the consistency principle and the completeness principle, then we come from the epistemic logic back to the classical logic. For imaginary words, hold the following basic principles which are fundamental for the adoption of semantic rules for imaginary words. So these principles are in some kind meta principles for building up a semantic for epistemic logic. P1. The semantic principles of the evaluation in imaginary words should be semantic principles of classical logic. P2, we act on the assumptions that from the absence of a sentence in an imaginary world, it cannot be concluded that another sentence is contained in this epistemic world. This principle is a generalization of the absence of the law of excluded middle in imaginary worlds. With this, the principle of epistemic completeness is rejected. However, the rejection of completeness is just a partial case of the application of principle P2. In a complete formulation, P2 states that for an epistemic world W, the conclusion that another sentence H is contained in the world W cannot be drawn from the fact that it is not true that the value of G in W is T. Is among the premises concerning the world if these premises are classically consistent and the world of each in W equals T cannot be drawn as a conclusion from the remaining positive premises. So the classical principle value G in W is equals T implies the value H in W equals T implies that the value of G implies H in W is T is ruled out, because from this principle we receive that from non-value G in W equals T follows the value of G implies H in W equals T, and this is ruled out by principle P2. Not acceptable for imaginary worlds is, according to P2, the well-known classical principle for disjunction splitting. If the value of G or H is 2, then the value of G is 2, or the value of H is 2. Because this is equivalent with if the value of G or H is 2 and the value of, and it is not the case that the value of G is true, then the value of H is true. And principle P3, imaginary worlds can contain arbitrary sentences. The containment of a sentence or a set of sentences in an imaginary epistemic world does not exclude the containment of other sentences in this world. For epistemic worlds, there is no principle of kind as indicated here, that from given premises that the value of some sentences are true, would follow that the value of another sentence is not true. From this principle P3, as a partial case, is excluded the consistency principle, but excluded are also other classically signed principles like if the value of G or H is true, then it is not the case that the value of non-G is true, or the value it is not the case that the value of non-H is true. Because the equivalent principle, the value of G or H and the value of non-G in W are true, then it is not the case that the value of non-G in W of T is directly excluded by principle P3. Principle P4, even if stated in P3 that imaginary worlds can contain arbitrary sentences, it should not be excluded that such worlds contain any sentence. That means even if imaginary worlds would contain a classically contradictory world, they are not absolutely contradictory worlds. For every imaginary world holds that at least one sentence is not contained in this world. From P4, for imaginary worlds follows the unsoundness of the contradiction explosion principle, CE, while the unsoundness of this principle does not follow from P3 and the unsoundness of the consistency principle. In accordance with after this principle we have one positive principle, in addition to the negative postulates K2, K3, and P4. For the construction of semantics for imaginary worlds, the following positive postulate is adopted. P5 semantic systems appropriate for imaginary worlds transform into semantic systems adequate for classical worlds if principles consistency and completeness are assumed for epistemic worlds. In accordance with the principles P1 to P5, we formulate the following semantics S1 and S2. I wish to direct your attention to ER3 star, where the application of the disjunctive syllogism is confined to such cases where the added part, negated part of the alternative has to be non-contradictory given, as is known from typological entailment. And semantics S2 differs from semantic S1 in not adopting the principle of the introduction of alternatives, but confining this semantic rule only for such cases where the ground for the application of the introduction rule is not a contradictory sentences. So from the truth of G we can receive the truth of G or H only if not at the same time non-G is true in this world. On the other hand, the confinement of the disjunctive syllogism here is not given. The disjunctive syllogism holds without any confinement. With this variant of the restriction of the introduction rule for the disjunction to internally consistent assumptions introduced in S2, we have a way to avoid the connected with the adoption of ER2 and ER3 violation of the basic principle P1 to P5. This possibility is overlooked and not persecuted in the system of typological entailments as an alternative to avoid intuitively unacceptable results from the joint adoption of ER2 and ER3 in the case of unlimited acceptance of ER3, the disjunctive syllogism, we have consequently not only the flat rejection of the disjunction introduction ER2, as happens in the Perry-Dunn system of first-degree analytic implication, or in the system of strict entailment of Vasiliev, but in line with the basic intuition of typological entailments, one can restrict ER2 to ER2 star in order to ensure that the disjunction can be introduced under the condition of the consistent adoption of one of the members of the to be introduced disjunction. So I have left to have some papers here. To come to the epistemic logic, where we have epistemic operators, we can determine different notions of epistemic assent. In contrast to the classical truth concept. The concept of epistemic truth is related to epistemic subjects, but the relations R and R we express by the relations R and R we express the relatedness between epistemic subjects and epistemic words. First, X holds in the word W1 that the epistemic word W2 is a possible actual word, and for RR, X holds in the word W1 that the epistemic word W2 is an actual word. With the help of the given relations, we can determine three variants of predicates of epistemic truth for the epistemic subject X. First, the strong notion of assent, which is built in analogy with the notion of necessity, with a difference that we here are referring not to ontological possible words but to epistemic possible words. The factual notion of assent R is related to this possible epistemic word which holds the epistemic subject for the actual word, and the weak notion of assent is fulfilled if the weak assented sentence G is true in one epistemic possible words. Given this introduction of the notions of epistemic assent, we can form and prove assertions about the epistemic relations between different assents of an epistemic subject. I have to shorten this here because of the time, but can refer to the paper which is in the internet on the page of the conference. So you can, if you like, you can read how the story ends. Thank you very much. Any questions?